The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, casting golden patterns across the marble floors that Catherine had walked countless times before. Yet today, something felt different. The weight of tradition seemed heavier somehow, pressing down on her shoulders like an invisible cloak she could never remove. Catherine Wales, once known to the world as Kate Middleton, stood in her private sitting room, holding a letter that would change everything she thought she knew about her role as a future queen. The official seal of the royal household had been broken just moments before, and the contents still made her hands tremble slightly. New protocols, she whispered to herself, reading the formal language that essentially rewrote the rules of her existence. After years of carefully learning the traditions, mastering the curtsies, and understanding the delicate balance of royal life, everything was shifting beneath her feet once again. The letter detailed sweeping changes to royal protocol, changes that would affect every aspect of her daily life. Some were subtle adjustments that the public might never notice, while others would fundamentally alter how she could interact with the world around her. The modernization of the monarchy, they called it, but Catherine wasn't sure if it felt like progress or simply another cage with different bars. She remembered the early days when she first began dating William. Back then, she was just Kate from Berkshire, a girl who could pop into the local shops without security details, who could hug her friends without considering the implications, who could speak her mind without every word being analyzed by constitutional experts. Those freedoms had gradually slipped away as their relationship became more serious. But she had accepted each sacrifice as part of the price of love. Now, even those remaining freedoms were being systematically removed. The first major change involved her personal friendships. According to the new protocols, all personal relationships would need to be formally reviewed and approved by the Royal Protection Unit and the private secretary's office. This wasn't just about security clearances anymore. It was about ensuring that every person in her inner circle met specific criteria related to their public image, their social media presence, and their potential influence on the monarchy's reputation. Catherine thought about Sarah, her university roommate who had been by her side through thick and thin. Sarah, who had held her hair back during those nervous nights before big events with William's family. Sarah, who had been the first person Catherine called when she got engaged, and who had been a bridesmaid at the wedding that captured the world's attention. Under the new rules, even Sarah's friendship would need to be officially evaluated and documented. The irony wasn't lost on Catherine that in becoming more royal, she was becoming less human. The second major change concerned her public appearances and the causes she could support. While she had always needed approval for her charitable patronages and public engagements, the new rules were far more restrictive. She could no longer make spontaneous visits to organizations that moved her heart. Every appearance needed to be planned months in advance, with detailed security assessments, media strategies, and political impact evaluations. This particularly stung because Catherine had always prided herself on her authentic connections with the charities she supported. Some of her most meaningful moments as a royal had come from unscripted interactions with children at hospitals, with families in crisis, with ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. The new protocols would make such genuine moments virtually impossible. She remembered visiting a children's hospice the previous year, where she had ended up staying 2 hours longer than planned because she couldn't tear herself away from a little girl named Emma who had been showing her drawings. Under the new rules, such flexibility would be impossible. Every minute would be accounted for, every interaction carefully managed. The third change was perhaps the most personal: restrictions on her family life and how she could raise her children. While the royal children had always lived under special circumstances, the new protocols introduced additional layers of security and protocol that would affect even the most basic family activities. George, Charlotte, and Louis would now need formal security assessments for playdates with friends. Their birthday parties could no longer include certain types of entertainment or activities deemed inappropriate for royal children. Even family vacations would be subject to new restrictions, with approved destinations and detailed itineraries that left little room for the spontaneous family moments Catherine treasured most. She thought about the previous summer when they had taken the children to visit her parents in Berkshire. The kids had spent the afternoon helping their grandfather in his garden, getting gloriously dirty and completely carefree. Under the new rules, such visits would require advanced security sweeps, approved activities, and probably media management strategies in case photographers caught glimpses of the two normal royal children. The fourth major change involved her personal expression and autonomy. The new protocols included detailed guidelines about her appearance, her speech, and even her body language during public appearances. While she had always been conscious of representing the monarchy appropriately, the new rules were extraordinarily specific. She could no longer wear certain colors that might be interpreted as political statements. Her hairstyles needed advance approval from the royal household's image consultants. Even her facial expressions during public events would be monitored more closely, with specific training sessions on appropriate royal demeanor scheduled monthly. The guidelines included a particularly painful restriction on physical affection. While she had already learned to modify her naturally warm and tactile personality for public appearances, the new rules were even more stringent. Hugs were to be strictly limited and only in pre-approved circumstances. Even holding William's hand during public appearances would now require consideration of the specific context and media implications. Catherine set the letter down on her desk and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where tourists were already gathering with their cameras, hoping for a glimpse of royal life. She wondered what they would think if they knew how carefully choreographed that life truly was, how every spontaneous moment was actually the result of careful planning and endless protocols. The changes weren't cruel or unreasonable, she told herself. They were the result of a changing world, where social media could turn any casual comment into an international incident, where security threats were more complex than ever before, where the monarchy needed to navigate an increasingly complicated political and social landscape. But understanding the reasons didn't make the emotional impact any less significant. Catherine had spent years finding ways to be authentic within the constraints of royal life, carving out small spaces where she could still be herself while fulfilling her duties. These new rules seemed to eliminate even those tiny refuges of normalcy. She thought about William and how he would take the news. He had grown up with these kinds of restrictions, had never known a life without protocols and security assessments. For him, the changes would be adjustments to an already structured existence. But for Catherine, each new rule felt like another piece of her former self being filed away in some palace archive, labeled incompatible with royal duties. The most difficult part was explaining it to herself, let alone to anyone else. How could she complain about restrictions when she lived in palaces and had access to opportunities most people could never dream of? How could she mourn the loss of freedoms when she had willingly chosen this life? Yet the grief was real. She was mourning not just the specific activities she could no longer do, but the gradual transformation of her identity from a person who happened to be royal to a royal who happened to be a person. The distinction might seem subtle to outsiders, but she felt it in her bones every day. Catherine picked up her phone, instinctively wanting to call her mother for comfort and advice. But even that impulse now came with calculations. Was this the right time? Would the conversation need to be documented? What if photographers are watching the house and captured images of her looking distressed after a phone call? The spontaneity of seeking comfort from loved ones had become another casualty of her position. As she stood there, surrounded by the opulence of Kensington Palace, but feeling more isolated than ever, Catherine made a decision that would shape how she approached the challenges ahead. She would find a way to honor both the requirements of her role and the essence of who she had always been. It wouldn't be easy, and it would require creativity and courage she wasn't sure she possessed, but she owed it to herself, to her children, and to the millions of people who looked to the royal family for inspiration. The new rules would change what she could do, but they couldn't change who she was at her core. that would have to be enough to sustain her through the difficult transition ahead, even as she grieved for the parts of herself that were being systematically archived in the name of royal duty. The morning sun had shifted as she stood lost in thought, and now the patterns on the floor had changed completely. Perhaps that was a metaphor for everything else in her life, constantly shifting, requiring constant adaptation, but still fundamentally the same space beneath it all. Catherine straightened her shoulders, folded the letter carefully, and began to plan how she would navigate this new chapter of her royal life, knowing that millions of people around the world would be watching to see how their future queen handled the weight of an ever-evolving crown. The weeks following the delivery of the new protocols proved more challenging than Catherine had initially anticipated. What seemed like mere policy changes on paper translated into profound shifts in the rhythm of her daily existence. Each morning brought fresh reminders of how thoroughly her life was being reshaped by forces beyond her control. The first real test came during what should have been a simple family breakfast. George had woken up with a slight fever. Nothing serious, but enough to make Catherine want to cancel her scheduled appearance at a children's literacy event. In the past, such a decision would have been straightforward. Family came first, and her staff would handle the rescheduling with appropriate apologies. But under the new protocols, even this simple maternal instinct required navigation through multiple layers of approval. The private secretary's office needed to assess the public relations implications of the cancellation. The Royal Protection Unit had to evaluate whether a last-minute schedule change posed security risks. The media team required time to craft statements that wouldn't fuel speculation about royal family health issues. Catherine found herself in the surreal position of needing permission to prioritize her sick child, watching the clock tick by as George lay on the sofa, asking why Mummy couldn't just stay home like other mothers did when their children weren't feeling well. The innocent question pierced through all the rational explanations about duty and responsibility, striking directly at the heart of her maternal conflict. By the time approval came through for the cancellation, nearly 3 hours later, George was feeling better and asking to go to the park. The bureaucratic machinery had taken longer to process the decision than the actual crisis that had prompted it. Catherine couldn't decide whether to laugh or cry at the absurdity of it all. The incident highlighted a painful reality she was still adjusting to. Her instincts as a mother, as a wife, and as a human being would now need to be filtered through institutional considerations before they could be acted upon. The spontaneous love and care that should define family relationships were being systematized and processed like state affairs. This became even more apparent during Charlotte's school play rehearsal the following week. Catherine had been looking forward to the event for months, remembering her own mother's presence at similar school functions, and wanted to provide that same support for her daughter. Charlotte had been cast as a sunflower in the spring production, and her excitement was infectious. However, the new security protocols required advanced scouting of the school venue, background checks on all other parents who would be in attendance, and coordination with local law enforcement. What had once been a simple matter of showing up to support her daughter now required a security operation that cost more than many families earned in a year. Worse yet, the security requirements inadvertently created a spectacle that overshadowed the children's performance. Other parents found themselves subjected to additional screening procedures because of Catherine's presence. Some families felt uncomfortable with the increased security measures and chose not to attend, meaning some children performed for smaller audiences because a royal parent was in attendance. Catherine watched Charlotte beam with pride when she spotted her mother in the audience, completely unaware of the complicated machinery that had made that moment possible. The pure joy on her daughter's face made all the complications worthwhile, but it also underscored how her presence, meant to be a gift to her children, was becoming a burden on others. The social implications of the new protocols became increasingly apparent as Catherine's circle of friends began to shrink. The formal review process for personal relationships wasn't just invasive, it was also time-consuming and emotionally draining for everyone involved. Friends who had known Catherine for years suddenly found themselves answering detailed questionnaires about their political views, their financial situations, and their social media activities. Sarah, her former roommate, struggled particularly with the new requirements. During what was supposed to be a casual coffee catch-up, she confessed to Catherine that the review process had made her feel like she was applying for a government security clearance rather than simply wanting to maintain a friendship that predated Catherine's royal status. "I understand why it's necessary," Sarah said, stirring her coffee absently. "But it's changed how I think about everything I say around you, everything I post online, even who I date. I'm constantly wondering if my choices might somehow reflect badly on you or the monarchy. It's exhausting." Catherine felt the familiar ache of loss that had become a constant companion. Another relationship was being strained by the institutional requirements of her position. The irony was particularly bitter because the protocols designed to protect the monarchy's reputation were actually isolating her from the very connections that made her relatable to the public in the first place. The restrictions on her charitable work proved equally frustrating. Catherine had always found profound meaning in her patronages and public engagements, viewing them as opportunities to use her platform for genuine good. The causes she supported weren't just official duties. They were expressions of her values and her desire to make a meaningful contribution to society. Under the new protocols, even her most established charitable relationships required reassessment. Organizations she had supported for years suddenly found themselves subjected to enhanced scrutiny. Some smaller charities, lacking the resources to navigate the new administrative requirements, quietly withdrew from consideration for royal patronage rather than struggle with the bureaucratic burden. Catherine discovered this during a particularly painful conversation with the director of a small charity focused on supporting teenage mothers. The organization had been doing remarkable work in underserved communities, exactly the kind of grassroots effort that Catherine believed deserved royal attention and support. "We're honored by your Royal Highness's interest," the director explained over the phone, "but the new requirements are beyond our capacity. We need to hire additional staff just to manage the reporting and security protocols. That money could help dozens of young mothers instead." Catherine found herself in the heartbreaking position of having to accept that her support, intended to help vulnerable young women, might actually drain resources from the very people she wanted to serve. The mathematics of bureaucracy were working against the arithmetic of compassion. These experiences began to affect Catherine's sense of purpose and identity in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had always taken pride in being a working royal who genuinely engaged with her duties rather than simply going through the motions. The new restrictions were making authentic engagement increasingly difficult to achieve. During a visit to a hospital children's ward under the new protocols, Catherine found herself adhering to a minute-by-minute schedule that left little room for the organic interactions that had always been the most meaningful part of such visits. She was guided from bed to bed with military precision, allowed specific amounts of time for each conversation, and required to follow approved talking points rather than responding naturally to whatever the children wanted to discuss. One little boy, maybe 7 years old, was in the middle of telling her an elaborate story about his pet hamster when the schedule demanded that she move on to the next bed. The story was clearly important to him. His eyes bright with the universal childhood need to share something precious with a sympathetic adult. Under the old protocols, Catherine would have listened for as long as he needed to talk. Under the new rules, she had to interrupt him with a gentle but firm transition to maintain the schedule. The disappointment in his eyes haunted her for weeks afterward. She realized that in trying to make royal visits more efficient and manageable, the new protocols were systematically eliminating the very moments that made such visits worthwhile. The children didn't need a perfectly orchestrated royal appearance. They needed a kind adult who had time to listen to their stories. Catherine began to understand that the changes weren't just affecting her personal life. They were fundamentally altering the nature of her public role as well. The monarchy was becoming more corporate and less human, more concerned with managing perception than with facilitating genuine connection between the royal family and the people they served. The impact on her family relationships extended beyond her children to her interactions with William as well. Their marriage had always been a partnership built on mutual support and shared understanding of the unique pressures they faced. But the new protocols created additional stress points that tested even their strong foundation. William, having grown up in the royal system, sometimes struggled to understand Catherine's grief over freedoms he had never possessed. When she expressed frustration about the new restrictions, he would remind her of the greater good they were serving, the stability and continuity the monarchy provided to the nation. His responses were loving, but sometimes felt dismissive of her emotional reality. Catherine found herself caught between her respect for William's perspective and her need to process her own feelings about the changes. She couldn't share her deepest concerns about the protocols without seeming ungrateful for her position, but she also couldn't pretend that the adjustments weren't taking a significant emotional toll. The isolation became more pronounced when she realized that even discussing her feelings about the changes was complicated by the new rules. Conversations with friends and family were subject to increased scrutiny. Her personal diary, which had always been a private refuge for processing her thoughts, now carried security implications that made even private reflection feel exposed. Catherine began to understand that privacy itself had become another casualty of the evolving royal protocols. Not just public privacy, which she had surrendered long ago, but the internal privacy of her own thoughts and feelings. The institutional machinery of the monarchy was so pervasive that it seemed to reach into every corner of her existence, leaving her with less and less space to simply be herself. As the autumn weeks turned colder, Catherine found herself standing at the same window where she had first read the protocol changes, watching the leaves fall in the palace gardens. The metaphor wasn't lost on her. Things that had once been full of life and color were falling away, leaving behind something starker, but perhaps more enduring. She was beginning to realize that adapting to the new protocols wouldn't just require learning new procedures. It would require a fundamental reimagining of how she understood her role, her relationships, and herself. The woman she had been was still there, but she was being asked to express herself through increasingly narrow channels. The question that kept her awake at night was whether those channels would be sufficient to sustain the person she was determined to remain, or whether she would gradually become someone else entirely. Someone who fit perfectly within the protocols, but who had lost the essential humanity that had made her royal service meaningful in the first place. Winter arrived at Kensington Palace with an unusual sharpness, as if the season itself was reflecting the new constraints that had settled over Catherine's life like frost on windows. The shorter days seemed to mirror how compressed her world had become, with each hour more carefully managed and every moment subject to protocols that grew more complex by the week. The holiday season, traditionally a time when royal families could retreat somewhat from public scrutiny and enjoy more private family moments, proved to be another battleground between old freedoms and new restrictions. Catherine had always cherished the Christmas period as a time when royal duties lightened and family traditions could take precedence. This year, even those precious weeks were being transformed by the evolving requirements of her role. The annual Christmas card photo session, once a relatively informal affair where the family could capture a genuine moment of togetherness, now required extensive planning and multiple approvals. The location needed security clearance. The photographer required enhanced background checks, and even the children's clothing choices were subject to review for appropriate royal messaging. Catherine found herself sitting in a formal meeting about Christmas card imagery, listening to consultants discuss the brand implications of having Louis wear a particular sweater or Charlotte's hairstyled in a certain way. The absurdity of reducing her children's natural charm to marketing considerations felt like a fundamental violation of motherhood itself. When George asked why they needed to take so many photos for the Christmas card when one good picture should be enough, Catherine struggled to explain without revealing her own frustration with the process. How do you tell a young child that nothing in their life can be spontaneous anymore? that even family photographs require the same level of planning as state visits. The restrictions on holiday travel proved particularly challenging for Catherine's relationship with her parents. The Middleton family had always provided a crucial anchor of normalcy in her increasingly royal existence. Her parents' home in Berkshire represented one of the few places where she could still feel like Kate rather than Catherine, where protocols loosened enough to allow for genuine family time. But the new security requirements made visits to her parents' home dramatically more complicated. The quiet neighborhood where she had grown up now required security sweeps that disrupted the entire community. Neighbors found their daily routines interrupted by advanced security teams, and the media attention that followed Catherine's visits made life difficult for everyone in the area. Her father, Michael, tried to maintain his characteristic good humor about the situation, but Catherine could see the strain it was causing. During one visit, she overheard him apologizing to a neighbor whose delivery truck had been delayed by security protocols. The humble graciousness with which he handled the situation made Catherine's heart ache with love and guilt in equal measure. "We understand, Michael," the neighbor had assured him. "We're proud of Catherine and what she's accomplished. But it's just different now, isn't it?" Different. That word seemed to encapsulate everything about Catherine's evolving experience. Not necessarily worse, but undeniably different in ways that created distance where closeness had once existed naturally. The impact on her mother, Carol, was perhaps even more difficult to witness. Carol had always been Catherine's closest confidant, the person she could call when royal life felt overwhelming or when she needed perspective on balancing her roles as a mother and a public figure. The new protocols didn't technically prevent their conversations, but they cast a shadow over them that made complete openness feel risky. Catherine noticed her mother choosing words more carefully during their phone calls, perhaps aware that even family conversations might be subject to security monitoring. The natural flow of their relationship was being constrained by awareness of its potential public implications. Privacy, Catherine was learning, wasn't just something you lost publicly. It was something that infected even your most intimate relationships once it was gone. The restrictions on public appearances were becoming more psychologically challenging as Catherine began to understand their full implications. She had always viewed her royal engagements as opportunities to connect with people from all walks of life, to learn about their challenges, and hopefully provide some encouragement or support. These interactions have been one of the most fulfilling aspects of her royal role. Under the new protocols, spontaneous interactions were virtually eliminated. Every conversation during public engagements was now subject to time limits and topic guidelines. Catherine could no longer allow conversations to develop naturally, following wherever people's interests or needs might lead. Instead, she found herself managing interactions according to predetermined scripts and schedules. During a visit to a community center in Manchester, Catherine met an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had clearly been looking forward to the royal visit for weeks. Mrs. Patterson began sharing stories about her late husband's military service, drawing connections to Catherine's own patron role with military charities. It was exactly the kind of meaningful conversation that had always made Catherine's public work feel worthwhile. But the schedule demanded that Catherine move on after exactly 3 minutes, cutting off Mrs. Patterson in the middle of a story about her husband's service in the Falklands. The disappointment in the elderly woman's eyes was heartbreaking, but the security and administrative staff were inflexible about maintaining the timetable. Catherine found herself offering empty promises about perhaps continuing the conversation another time, knowing that such opportunities were unlikely to arise. These accumulated moments of abbreviated human connection began to take a toll on Catherine's sense of purpose in her royal role. She had entered into this life believing that she could use her platform to make genuine differences in people's lives. The new protocols seemed designed to prevent exactly the kind of authentic engagement that had the potential to create real impact. The changes in her relationship with the media represented another significant shift. While Catherine had never enjoyed the intense scrutiny that came with royal life, she had learned to work within certain understood boundaries. The new protocols changed these dynamics in ways that were both more restrictive and more invasive simultaneously. On one hand, the new rules severely limited her ability to interact with journalists in even the most basic ways. Casual conversations with royal correspondents, which had sometimes provided opportunities to clarify misunderstandings or provide context for royal decisions, were now forbidden without prior approval from multiple palace departments. On the other hand, the protocols required more detailed documentation of her activities, more formal statements about her positions on various issues, and more structured media opportunities that felt less authentic than the informal interactions they replaced. Catherine found herself longing for the days when she could simply smile genuinely at reporters rather than calculating whether that smile might be interpreted as taking a political position. The psychological impact of living under such constant scrutiny and restriction began manifesting in ways Catherine hadn't expected. She found herself second-guessing natural impulses, analyzing her own reactions before allowing herself to feel them. The spontaneous joy she had always taken in simple pleasures was being filtered through considerations of appropriate royal behavior. During a private family dinner at Kensington Palace, Louis spilled juice on his shirt, and Catherine instinctively laughed at his theatrical expression of dismay. Then, she caught herself wondering if such laughter was appropriately dignified for a future queen, if someone might interpret her amusement as not taking parental discipline seriously enough. The fact that she was monitoring her own reactions during private family moments represented a troubling erosion of the boundary between her public and personal selves. The protocols weren't just changing how she behaved in public. They were changing how she experienced her own emotions, even in supposedly private spaces. William noticed the change and tried to address it during one of their increasingly rare moments alone together. "You seem to be carrying the weight of every decision," he observed gently. "The protocols are guidelines, not straitjackets. You're still allowed to be yourself." But Catherine wasn't sure that was entirely true anymore. The guidelines had become so comprehensive and the consequences of deviation so significant that the distinction between being herself and fulfilling her role was becoming increasingly blurred. She was beginning to lose track of where Catherine Wales ended and the institutional requirements began. The impact on her physical health began to manifest as well. The stress of constant self-monitoring, combined with the loss of many of her previous outlets for relaxation and genuine human connection, was taking its toll. Catherine had always been physically active and had used exercise as a way to manage the pressures of royal life. But even her fitness routine now required security considerations and scheduling complexities that made it feel like another obligation rather than a release. Her favorite yoga instructor, who had been coming to the palace for private sessions, failed the enhanced background check required under the new protocols. The reason was minor and completely unrelated to any security concerns, but the rigid application of new standards meant that Catherine lost yet another source of personal comfort and stress relief. Finding a replacement instructor required weeks of security vetting and bureaucratic processing, during which Catherine's stress levels continued to rise without her usual outlet. When the new instructor finally arrived, she was competent but lacked the personal connection and understanding that had made the previous sessions so valuable. Catherine found herself grieving not just the loss of a service provider, but the loss of a human relationship that had contributed to her well-being. The cumulative effect of all these changes was beginning to create a sense of disconnection from her own life that Catherine found deeply troubling. She was living in increasingly beautiful surroundings, with access to unprecedented opportunities and resources, but feeling less and less like herself. The protocols designed to protect and support her were instead creating a kind of gilded isolation that threatened to transform her from a person who happened to be royal into a royal who struggled to remain a person. As winter deepened and the new year approached, Catherine realized that she was facing a choice about how to respond to these changes. She could accept them as the inevitable price of her position and gradually adjust her expectations of what her life could include. Or she could find ways to preserve essential elements of her humanity and authenticity within the constraints, even if it required more effort and creativity than she had ever imagined. The decisions she made would not only affect her own well-being and happiness, but would also influence what kind of example she set for her children about how to maintain integrity and authenticity under extraordinary pressure. The stakes felt enormous, and Catherine was beginning to understand that navigating the new protocol successfully would require not just compliance, but wisdom, courage, and a clear vision of who she was determined to remain despite everything that was changing around her. Spring came early to London that year, as if nature itself was offering Catherine a reminder that renewal was possible even after the harshest winters. Standing in the same palace window where she had first confronted the reality of the new protocols months earlier, she could see the first green shoots pushing through the soil in the palace gardens. The metaphor wasn't lost on her, but this time it offered hope rather than despair. The months of struggling with the restrictions had taught Catherine something she hadn't expected to learn: that adaptation didn't necessarily mean surrender. While she couldn't change the protocols that now governed her life, she had gradually discovered ways to honor both their requirements and her own essential nature. It hadn't been easy, and the solutions weren't perfect, but she had found a path forward that preserved what mattered most to her. The breakthrough had come during an unexpected conversation with Queen Camilla, who had requested a private tea to discuss how Catherine was adjusting to the changes. Catherine had been hesitant about the meeting, unsure whether she could speak honestly about her struggles without appearing ungrateful or uncommitted to her royal duties. But Camilla surprised her with both understanding and practical wisdom. "You know," Camilla had said, stirring her tea thoughtfully, "I spent years trying to fit myself into predefined royal molds before I realized that the monarchy is actually strengthened when we bring our authentic selves to the role, not weakened." Camilla shared her own experiences of navigating royal protocols while maintaining her sense of self, offering concrete strategies that Catherine hadn't considered. More importantly, she validated Catherine's feelings about the changes while encouraging her to see them as challenges to overcome rather than defeats to accept. "The protocols exist to protect the institution," Camilla explained, "but within those boundaries, there's still enormous space for creativity, authenticity, and genuine impact. The key is learning to work with the constraints rather than against them." This conversation had sparked a shift in Catherine's approach to her situation. Instead of viewing the new protocols as limitations that diminished her effectiveness, she began to see them as parameters within which she needed to find new ways to achieve her goals. It required different strategies, but it didn't require abandoning her values or her vision of meaningful royal service. Catherine's first successful innovation involved her charitable work. While the new protocols made spontaneous visits impossible and required extensive advance planning, Catherine realized that this forced planning could actually be used to create deeper, more impactful engagements. If she had to schedule everything months in advance, she could use that time to thoroughly research the organization she was visiting and develop more substantial ongoing relationships with them. Working with her private secretary, Catherine developed a new model for royal patronages that emphasized long-term partnerships rather than one-time visits. Instead of spreading herself across dozens of organizations for brief appearances, she focused on a smaller number of causes where she could make a more substantial difference over time. The results exceeded her expectations. With one children's literacy charity, Catherine was able to work closely with their leadership over several months to develop a new program that combined her interests in early childhood development with their expertise in educational intervention. The advanced planning required by the new protocols allowed for detailed collaboration that would have been impossible under the old system of more spontaneous engagements. When Catherine finally visited the charity to launch the program, the event was far more meaningful than traditional royal visits because it represented the culmination of months of collaborative work rather than a ceremonial appearance. The children and families involved could see concrete results from the royal partnership, and Catherine felt genuinely connected to the impact she was helping to create. This success inspired Catherine to reimagine other aspects of her royal role. The restrictions on personal friendships, while still painful, led her to develop deeper relationships with the friends who remained in her circle after the review process. Instead of maintaining casual relationships with many acquaintances, she invested more time and energy into friendships that had proven strong enough to withstand the institutional scrutiny. Sarah, her university friend, had ultimately passed the review process, and their friendship had actually been strengthened by the experience of navigating the challenges together. "It's like we've been through something difficult together," Sarah explained during one of their carefully scheduled but deeply meaningful coffee meetings. "I understand better now what you're dealing with, and I think you understand better how much your friendships mean to people." Catherine also found creative ways to maintain connections with her extended family and community. While visits to her parents' house required significant security planning, she discovered that these planned visits could be more intentional and meaningful than the casual drop-ins of the past. Instead of brief, frequent visits, she now spent longer, more focused time with her family, creating traditions and memories that were actually richer for being carefully protected. The restrictions on her children's activities had initially seemed like one of the most painful aspects of the new protocols, but Catherine gradually found ways to work within them while preserving the normal childhood experiences she wanted to provide. The advanced planning required for playdates and school events meant that she had to be more selective, but it also allowed her to ensure that the activities her children did participate in were particularly well-suited to their interests and needs. When George expressed interest in learning to play cricket, the security requirements meant that joining a local youth cricket league wasn't feasible. Instead, Catherine arranged for private coaching sessions that could include carefully selected friends of George's, creating a smaller but equally meaningful social and athletic experience. The personal attention actually allowed George to develop his skills more quickly than might have been possible in a larger group setting. The changes in her media relationships had initially felt like losing an important tool for connecting with the public, but Catherine discovered that the new formal structures could actually be more effective when used strategically. The required advanced planning for media interactions allowed her to prepare more thoughtfully and ensure that her public statements more accurately reflected her genuine positions on important issues. Working with the Palace communication team, Catherine developed a more intentional approach to public messaging that felt more authentic than the reactive responses that had sometimes characterized royal media relations in the past. When she did speak publicly, her words carried more weight because they represented careful consideration rather than spontaneous reactions. Perhaps most importantly, Catherine learned to find moments of genuine connection within the structured environment of official engagements. While the time limits and schedule requirements remained in place, she discovered that authentic human connection could still occur within those constraints when she brought her full attention and presence to each interaction. During a visit to a veteran support center, Catherine met James, a former soldier struggling with post-traumatic stress. The schedule allowed only 5 minutes for their conversation, but Catherine used those minutes to listen with complete focus and presence. Although their interaction was brief, James later told staff members that he felt genuinely heard and understood by the Princess of Wales in a way that provided meaningful encouragement. Catherine realized that the depth of connection wasn't always proportional to the amount of time available. By bringing her full attention and authentic care to each brief interaction, she could still create moments that mattered to the people she met, even within the rigid constraints of the new protocols. The physical and emotional toll of the changes gradually lessened as Catherine developed new routines and strategies for managing stress within the constraints. She couldn't have her previous yoga instructor, but she worked with the vetted replacement to develop a practice that was specifically designed to help her manage the unique pressures of royal life. The new sessions actually proved more beneficial than the old ones because they were tailored to her specific needs rather than following a general format. Catherine also developed new forms of private time and personal space within the palace environment. She created a small corner of her sitting room that was designated as her personal retreat, where she could write in her journal, read for pleasure, or simply sit quietly without any thought to royal duties or public responsibilities. Even 15 minutes in this space each day helped her maintain connection with herself amid all the external demands. The relationship with William had strengthened as they learned to navigate the new challenges together. Instead of their different perspectives on the protocols creating tension, they found ways to support each other's adjustments. William's experience with royal constraints helped Catherine find practical solutions, while Catherine's fresh perspective reminded William of the human cost of institutional requirements and helped him advocate for sensible modifications when possible. Their conversations about the protocols became opportunities for deeper understanding of each other's experiences and needs. Catherine learned to appreciate William's protective instincts and his commitment to preserving the monarchy for their children's future. William gained greater appreciation for the sacrifices Catherine had made in adapting to royal life and the ongoing emotional work required to maintain authenticity within institutional constraints. As the one-year anniversary of the protocol changes approached, Catherine reflected on the transformation she had undergone. She was undeniably different from the person she had been a year earlier, but the changes felt like growth rather than loss. She had developed resilience, creativity, and emotional sophistication that she might never have discovered under easier circumstances. The new protocols had indeed changed what she could do, but they had also revealed capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. She had learned to find meaning and authenticity within constraints, to create genuine impact through careful planning rather than spontaneous action, and to maintain her essential humanity while fulfilling increasingly complex institutional requirements. Looking forward, Catherine felt cautiously optimistic about her ability to continue evolving with whatever changes might come. The monarchy would undoubtedly continue to adapt to changing social and political circumstances, and new protocols and restrictions would likely be introduced in the future. But she now had confidence in her ability to meet those challenges while preserving what mattered most to her. The woman who stood at the palace window on that spring morning was still recognizably the same person who had struggled with the protocol changes months earlier, but she was also stronger, wiser, and more intentional about how she approached her extraordinary life. The new rules had changed what Princess Catherine could no longer do, but they had also revealed what she could become when she brought her full creativity, determination, and humanity to the task of serving within constraints. The protocols would continue to evolve, and so would she. That was perhaps the most important lesson of all. That adaptation was not a one-time challenge to overcome, but an ongoing dance between institutional requirements and personal integrity that would define her entire royal journey. Catherine had learned the steps to that dance, and she was ready to continue performing it with grace, wisdom, and authenticity for as long as her service was needed.